course, English history too. Okay, so let's get started with the topic I've already announced, the emergence of the interventionist state. Let me see if I am recording. Okay, I am recording now. Okay, so the topics of the emergence of the interventionist state. In any introduction to political philosophy or to politics in general, the study of politics, and if you pay attention to any political debate in either in the news or in the media in general, you will probably notice that if we want to oversimplify what political philosophy is about, we have to say that everything comes down to debate what the role of the state is. And so different political parties, this has to do with political ideology, will debate in relation to that, and that is the controversy. So to what extent the state should control people's lives. And there are people who believe that the role of state is very important, to the extent that the role of the state is, for example, to control not only the economy, but also to regulate people's lives. For example, nowadays during the pandemic, there is a controversy around the vaccine, the new vaccine, if the state should force people to get the vaccine or not. And so everything comes down to the role of the state and how big the size of the state. In general, when we speak about political ideology, when those on the left or left of center, parties or movements or thinkers, they tend to think that the role of the state is or should be very big. And that the main role, those, for example, socialism believes that the role of the state is to redistribute wealth, because the main concern for socialists is equality. On the other hand, those on the right of center political ideology or political parties or thinkers, etc., they believe that the role of the state should be limited to just a few things. And there are political philosophers who believe that the role of the state should be limited to justice, security, education, and health. And even education is sometimes part of a controversy. And on the other hand, those on the left feel that the state should control or should be in charge of providing people with controlling everything. For example, controlling prices, controlling imports, controlling currency. For example, the price of dollars, who buys dollars, who cannot buy dollars, what kind of products can be imported from abroad. And as those on the left feel that the state should provide people, especially the unprivileged, with benefits. This is normally known as the welfare state. In Spanish is el estado de bienestar social or social justice. This implies that in order to pay for the cost of the welfare state, they feel that taxation or taxes should be collected at a higher rate, especially from those who can pay taxes, and this money should be distributed or redistributed on welfare programs for those who are in need. And when at the very beginning of this course, we started analyzing Adam Smith. I actually uploaded a video and a task for you to watch a video which in some way summarized Adam Smith's ideas, the free trade theory, which was in some way revolutionary because it came to refute or to attack a previous theory known as mercantilism. So Adam Smith believed that the state should not control the economy, that tariffs are the taxes products have to pay when going from one country to another. Adam Smith believed that states should not regulate or should not interfere in the economy, and that by lifting up taxes or tariffs, this was going to encourage or to increase the free exchange of products. This is basically the in a nutshell the free trade theory or liberalism or liberal ideas. Of course, there are different types of different degrees of liberalism, different schools of liberalism, in the same way as there are different schools of socialism or Marxism. But the topic we're going to speak today is very important because it is connected with what I introduced at the very earliest stage of this subject, the economic theory of free trade as stated by the father of liberalism, Adam Smith. Why is Adam Smith important? Well, because his ideas, the free trade, enterprise, or liberalism, sometimes called capitalism, but liberals don't like the label capitalism or capital because capitalism was used by Marx to refer to liberalism. So, for liberal thinkers, when they speak about the same conception about economy and also about life in general, they prefer the labels free enterprise or free trade instead of capitalism. But in the news and in everyday language, you will come across people talking about capitalism or liberalism, and sometimes pejoratively as neoliberalism, as something with a negative connotation. And why is Adam Smith part of this course? Well, because it is connected with it is connected with the Industrial Revolution. And in this video, you probably noticed that it was this context of free enterprise and the encouragement of entrepreneur behavior. That is to say, entrepreneur is a French word which means emprendedor. So these conditions, these social and political conditions, in some way contributed to the emergence of entrepreneurs and these free enterprise views. And this was the origin of the Industrial Revolution. So much of the concept of the political and economic theory that on which industrialization was based was liberalism. That is to say, the concept, according to Adam Smith, the state should not interfere in economic matters, and the state should, the role of the state should be limited just to a few things: justice, the police, defense, that is to say, paying for an army in case of a war, and that's it. Very few things. So the state, for example, according to this free trade theory, didn't have much of a role in intervene with the economic variables. For example, controlling prices or imports and exports and etc. And so private property and the rights of the private individual are sacred for liberalism. So the individual is essential for socialism or for Marxism or all the other schools that emerge from Marxism. The most important right or interest is the collective interest, not the individual interest. And so all through the 19th century, all through the climax of the Industrial Revolution, the theory that prevailed was the free trade theory. And that's why Britain managed to obtain cheap raw material to be used, for example, cotton from the US or coal or any other raw material to be used for her factories. And in the same way, this conception that, according to Adam Smith, that countries should specialize in producing whatever they have, in any areas where they have a competitive advantage. For example, let's imagine, I don't know, let's take it to a simple example from agriculture. For example, Argentina should not attempt at producing coffee or bananas because Argentina doesn't have the climate for those products. On the other hand, Argentina has competitive advantages in wheat or corn or soya now. So the state should be limited and should not control the economy. And under this conception, when we studied corn laws, we said that the Victorian values, los valores victorianos, we're not going to analyze them from a literary point of view, but from an economic point of view. From a literary point of view, well, I'm sure you're going to, or if you haven't already, you're going to study Victorian values in terms of conception of family, the conception of big families with lots of children, and how infidelity, homosexuality, etc., were considered as something underground. But this has to do with social aspects. But here we are talking about economy, and under this conception, poverty was considered or associated with laziness. And that's why under this conception, most of the governments during the 19th century, they designed systems to deal with poverty that were terribly cruel, like the poor law, or the workhouses, or the poor law system, that were literally prisons for the poor. By what we are going to see now is that these ideas that were taken for granted, everybody accepted that those who were poor were poor because they had not worked enough. But these ideas started to be questioned by the end of the 19th century, especially 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And And well, these ideas were started to be questioned when they were faced to facts. According to the free trade theory, the state should not or should tax the entrepreneurs as little as possible, because the more taxation, the investors were going to spend less money, and consequently this would be detrimental for the economy. This is the conception of classical liberalism. There are different schools of liberalism too. And so taxation was perceived as something negative, because according to this idea, the more money the capitalists or the middle classes or the owners of the factory, the more money they had, they were going to invest in more factories, and consequently, this was going to eventually eliminate unemployment, and everybody was going to get the benefits of wealth. This is sometimes called the leaking phenomenon. This is known in Spanish as el derrame. So even when at some point there are obviously people who are at the top who are making money, the factory owners, but according to these ideas, eventually, sooner or later, this wealth is going to leak, el derrame, to the lower classes and to the working classes. Well, by the end of the 19th century, there were some socialists that started to see that this effect of free trade theory was not a reality. Especially there were alarming data. There was alarming data about poverty rate, and especially malnutrition in children. So after many decades, imagine just 80 years or probably 100th century of free trade, they realized that, especially in London, there were lots of people living below the poverty rate, and consequently they realized that there were several generations, 2 or 3 generations of children who had not been properly fed. And so they realized that, well, if they wanted to recruit soldiers, most of the candidates, most of the applicants were not physically fit to go to war, and this was simply the result of lack of food at early stages of development. So that's why they realized that, apparently this leaking process is not taking place, is not happening. So there are lots of people who are actually in complete poverty, and consequently some, especially middle class people, or people who had studied, started to realize or to question or to see how can we remedy these problems, especially those in the Liberal Party and socialist parties. They were not socialist parties, but they were socialist movements. We're going to analyze them in detail. And so, well, in order to deal with these terrible social conditions, they started to question the Victorian principle and to say, okay, maybe this was wrong, and maybe the state does have a role. in improving people's life. And instead of having a limited state, maybe the state should have more power to intervene in the economy. And that's why the title says the emergence of the interventionist state. Because before, for most of the 19th century, the role of the state was considered to be very limited, and the state should not interfere at all. So this started to be questioned. So what happened in this period, that is sometimes called the Edwardian period in the notes, is revolutionary, because there were many changes, drastic changes, that cannot be perceived from our 21st century perspective. But in those times, for the first time in the history of Britain, and Britain was the model country in the world with the most advanced system of government. It was the closest to a democracy that the world had seen, with the USA. And so, like all these changes, for the first time, people started to see, okay, what can we do with the elderly? Because people could work, but there was a time in people's lives when people could not work. And so this implied that they started to realize that many people were poor, not because they were lazy, but simply because they had got old and could not work anymore. What is interesting about this chapter is that in some way it forces us to realize that many of the things that we take for granted nowadays, like pensions, free education, insurance in case of unemployment, free healthcare systems, etc. All these things did not exist during the 19th century. We are going to see that the British were the first who started to see, okay, we do have a problem here. What can we do with this? And they started to think about the elderly, the unemployed, free education, what to do with the children who could not eat at home. And so they started thinking about providing school meals, and etc. All these programs, or social programs, and this is also another present-day controversy. I want to insist on this, that this course, this subject, English History 2, is very interesting, because many of the things, I would say all the things that we study here are present-day debates. So by analyzing this topic, these two chapters, you are going to immediately recognize that many of the political debate in Argentina and in the world, because, well, just by watching at the political campaigns in the USA between the Republicans and the Democrats, there you could still perceive the two conceptions about the state. And of course, reality is much more complex, and I do not expect you to understand in very in-depth knowledge of liberalism or socialism or political ideology, but at least to have an idea. What is the role of the state? What size should the state have? Who's going to pay for that? Because every benefit that is granted by the state, it implies that the money for that entitlement has to be obtained from somewhere. Normally, it is by increasing taxes. And so then our role as taxpayers to demand a clear acknowledgement of what our money is being spent on. So whenever the government of the day says we are granted something free, well, this is not free. It is being, the money used for that is being taken for your taxes, the taxes you are paying in every single item you buy. So we tend to think about taxation, that taxation is only for the rich or the wealthy, but we pay lots of taxes in, well, the VAT, for example, what is known as value-added tax, or IVA in Spanish, is added to anything we buy in Argentina. It's one of the highest in the world, 21%. So if you buy a Coca-Cola or sugar or books or anything, you're paying taxes. And this, another issue that is going to be analyzed, that is dealt in more detail in chapter 18, has to do with taxation. And there are two types of taxation: indirect taxation and direct taxation. Indirect is when you make people pay taxes by taxes on consumption. When you buy anything, when you are filling the tank with petrol, well, you are paying taxes. When you sit at a restaurant to buy some meal, you're paying taxes. You're paying taxes for everything. These kind of taxes are known as indirect taxations, when you pay taxes as a result of buying something. And then there are the other type of taxes are the taxes known as direct taxations, which are going to be introduced in the 20th century, when some groups of people are taxed directly. They have to pay money. For example, income tax. Income tax, el impuesto a las ganancias, is a direct taxation, or tax on property or inheritance, etc. This is direct taxation. So, to sum up this idea, what we are going to see is that by the end of the 19th century, many of the Victorian principles, economic principles, and also Victorian values started to be questioned. These Victorian values had to do with free trade economic theory. And they started to see that, something had to be done. And later on, we are going to see that when all these reforms were introduced, that's to say, when Parliament passed many acts to deal with, for example, the Pension Act, Free Education Act, Insurance Act against people who were unemployed, etc. All this meant or implied that the state needed more money. So an interventionist state needs more money. And that's why we are going to see that in the 20th century, the British governments started to, or were forced in some way, to think about a tax reform. How to collect, how to change the system of taxation in order to collect more money so that this money could be used to all the social programs. So, needless to say that this is the same controversy that they are current controversies all over the world. Donald Trump promising a reduction in taxation, and Joe Biden promising subsidies for the black, for the immigrants, for the etc. Free healthcare, free education, etc. And something similar happens in Argentina. So there was a drastic change in the vision, in the conception about the role of the state in society. And there was not only in relation to social programs, because in some way they are connected. But for example, Joseph Chamberlain, you probably remember Chamberlain as part of the Liberal Party, one of the wings of the Liberal Party, the radical liberal. He, in some way, put a lot of emphasis in the proposal to pass an act known as the Old Pension Act, jubilaciones. Something that nowadays we take for granted, but in those times, people, when they got old, well, they depended on the support of their children. That's why sometimes people married to have children, because not having children implied that you were going to be poor when you could not work anymore. But Chamberlain, when he explained, Chamberlain for the first time as a radical, he questioned two things, because he said, we need to pass an act to help the elderly, but at the same time, he said, we need to impose tariffs. Tariffs, I remember, were the taxes products had to pay in order to be imported. Okay, let me close it's very noisy outside. So Chamberlain said, for the first time, he questioned free trade. So by the end of the 19th century, he said, how can we pay for these pensions for the elderly? And he said, well, by imposing tariffs. So to any product that the British wanted to import, these products were going to have a tariff, a tax. And the money collected was going to be used for the pensions. This seems to be something trivial, but in fact it is revolutionary, because for the first time after more than a century of advocating free trade, that the state should not tax foreign products, etc., Joseph Chamberlain said that two arguments. On the one hand, that the money collected was going to be used to pay pensions. And on the other hand, he said something that nowadays many politicians still use, that by closing the economy, that is to say, by putting tariffs, if you want to buy an iPhone or any product from abroad, this protectionism was going to prevent unemployment, or was going to guarantee full employment, because everything was going to be manufactured in Britain instead of bringing products from other countries. Later on, we are going to see that Britain was in a very special situation, because most of the food they consumed was brought from other countries. So they purchased food and they sold manufactured products. So it's not that easy to impose tariffs, because if you impose tariffs on products brought from other countries, well, those countries are likely to impose tariffs on your own products. So, and this is a kind of trade war instead of war, trade war. Chamberlain said that if government protected the domestic market from foreign imports, it would secure employment for British workers. This is what politicians on the left say even today. Another issue is that the party in government, when these change in ideas were actually put into acts of parliament, was the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party won the general election of 1906, and this was the beginning of a lot of transformations that had to do with all these ideas. So the ideas were before. These ideas started to question the Victorian values in the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s, but they were put into practice. These reforms were actually carried out in the 20th century, especially from 1906 to 1914. This is known as the Edwardian period. This also coincides with the 1900, the emergence of the Labour Party. Once the working classes, male workers, obtained the right to vote, this gave way, or in some way paved the way for the organization of the workers in political parties, and this gave birth to the Labour Party, the party of the workers. But during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the party that won the election, 1906, was the Liberal Party. And even when there was a Labour Party, and this is explained in the rest of the chapter, the workers continued voting for the Liberal Party. So there was a party of the workers, but the workers continue voting for the Liberal Party. We're going to see why. And so even when some historians believe that the birth of the Labour Party is the most important factor in all these changes, in these new conceptions about the role of the state. But this author says this is not true, because after the election of in the election of 1906, the liberals won an outstanding victory in the election, and the Conservative Party was the second party, and the Labour Party had very few MPs in Parliament. And so even when the Labour Party was practically insignificant, they did follow socialist or welfare programs. So we cannot say that it is because of the Labour Party, but the Labour Party did have an influence in the policies of the Liberal Party, especially because the Liberal Party wanted to get the popular support, the support of the working classes, and consequently, the Liberal Party, there were many liberal politicians and leaders that they also noticed that something had to be done, that the state did have a role. They were not going to question they were not socialist, and this is something that we are going to see later on, that even when Britain had and still has a Labour Party, the British Labour Party is different from Partido de los Trabajadores or Partido Laborista, many other working class political parties, which are normally socialist party. So the British Labour Party has a socialist agenda in the sense that they believe in, like the Democratic Party in the US, they believed in the fact that the state has a role to help the unprivileged, but they also believe in free trade, and they also believe in private property and individual freedom. So it's completely different to, I don't know, the Party of the Workers in North Korea. El Partido de los Trabajadores de Corea del Norte no es lo mismo que el Partido de los Trabajadores de Labour Party in Britain. El Partido de los Trabajadores en Corea del Norte o en China, doesn't believe in free trade and doesn't believe in democracy. So the label is different. So the most important thing for you to remember is that by the end of the 19th century, there was a change in ideas, and later on, at the beginning of the 20th century, these ideas were put into practice by especially liberal governments, which were committed to reform, to social reform. And also the conception about poverty also changed. Remember that during the most of the Victorian era, poverty was associated to laziness, and nowadays most people started to believe that sometimes poverty was either lack of opportunity or sometimes all the different fluctuations in the economy that made sometimes people redundant, and consequently workers and their families went through stages of poverty when they became redundant and could not work and be paid. So the two prime ministers to remember are Lloyd George. Remember that when they started passing all these acts to remedy the conditions of the elderly, the unemployed, the children, education for the children, etc., they realized that they had to change the system of taxation because money was not enough. Some of the reforms introduced by Lloyd George, this is a prime minister that you should remember, Lloyd George, because of this drastic change in the conception of the role of the state. So he introduced a health, the act is called National Insurance Act. Insurance means seguro, but this it was not as comprehensive, and the conception of universal healthcare systems or universal education as we have nowadays at that time did not exist, but it was an attempt. It was the beginning. So it was called the 1911 National Insurance Act, and it implied insurance, health insurance, so un seguro de salud. I always insist on the fact that we have to place, all historians have to place in the historical context of that time. So at that time, this was revolutionary. For the first time, the state was accepting that the state should provide people with health for free. It was compulsory for all workers below a certain income level, so not everybody, for some workers. Then they passed, or the same act included an unemployment insurance, which guarantee weekly cash payments as a right. So if somebody was unemployed, they had to apply for this insurance. This was especially important for the skilled workers, because otherwise they could drastically be driven to poverty and consequently end up in the workhouses. And these people were skilled workers, so they were necessary. They were trained to do specific jobs. One aspect that I've already mentioned is that all these initiatives by Lloyd George were far from a comprehensive program of welfare. We are going to see that a comprehensive system, by comprehensive we mean universal, un sistema universal de salud pública, is going to be introduced by the Labour Party after the Second World War. But this was an attempt to think about those who could not pay for a doctor. And during the Edwardian time, the government clearly had to accept a degree of responsibility to provide a minimum standard for its citizens. So this was completely different to the conception of the Victorian era, which it had not previously done. So this was an increase in social expenditure. And this is also another topic of debate between political parties and political thinkers. How much should the state spend on social programs? And in this particular case, it says expenditure on social services, with all these pensions for the elderly, meals for children's school, implied that social expenditure, what is known as gasto social in Español, rose from only 25 million in 1880s to 33 million by 1913. So there was a huge increase in social expenditure. And this is another debate. What priorities should the state have with the money collected from taxation? What percentage should be spent on education? What percentage should be spent on welfare programs, IFE, or what percentage should the state spend on education, housing, health, defense, for example, in the military, etc., paying the debt, the national debt, etc. This leads us into the reform. So the government increased social expenditure, so it needed to change the system of taxation. And this is known as the people's budget in the topic. Budget means presupuesto. And the people's budget, because this was the way in which politicians sometimes use suitable labels. The people's budget sería como el presupuesto de la gente. Sometimes politicians used, en español, piensen de impuesto solidario, fondo solidario para los incendios que hay en Córdoba, por ejemplo, aquí en Córdoba. Y primero que no es solidario porque te lo obligan a pagar. Entonces, acá the people's budget it is part of a speech pronounced by Lloyd George, and that was the title of the bill that later on became an act. So all these changes needed to change in the system of taxation. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer, what is known as the Minister of Economy in Britain, introduced a lot of reforms in this bill. The bill is un proyecto de ley that was called the People's Budget, by taxing. So on page 142, you have the listing of all the changes in taxation, and it can be summarized in the shift from indirect taxation, because indirect taxation, like VAT, for example, IVA in Spanish, affects everybody, to direct taxation. So taxing individual groups of people. So if we look at that, they introduced in this people's budget, this is a bill that later on we are going to see that, as you can imagine, the bill introduced new taxes for lots of group of people who were actually in government. So we're going to see how the establishment reacted to that. So they introduced taxes for by taxing unearned income at a higher rate than earned income. So unearned could be inheritance, for example. So the percentage of taxes that people were going to pay was higher for unearned income than for earned income. They also introduced a super tax. This is very similar to what the current day government in Argentina is trying to do with Impuesto a los Ricos. A super tax on incomes above for 5,000 at that time. And a principle that is like a slogan all governments repeat all the time, that taxation, the rate of taxation, o sea, el porcentaje de impuestos que todos pagamos, should be graduated according to each individual's ability to pay. Then, well, of course, then the most controversial issue is what is the minimum from which people should start paying income tax in Argentina, for example. So they introduced taxes for the very wealthy people more heavily. For example, they raised the revenue is taxes on motor cars. In those times, only the very, very rich had cars. And also they increased the rate on income tax and introduced the super tax. And the government also proposed new levies on the value of land, new taxes on land. So all this money, all this new revenue, all this money collected by the government was going to be used especially to the pockets of the poor. According to this source, the source we are using, Pew, he says Lloyd George's new taxes were not paid by working men or even by most middle-class employees. So apparently he has a positive view about this tax reform. And of course, it was the first time that a British government, a modern British government, thinks about or starts talking about the concept of redistribution of income, la redistribución del ingreso, or redistribution of wealth. Now, Sometimes when you think about this concept, for example, when you see a prime minister like Lloyd George speaking about redistribution of income, redistribution of wealth, etc., you may think that, well, the Liberal Party became socialist because these are the main policies of the Socialist Party. But Pew highlights on page 143 what the liberals were in fact, and the liberals were not socialist. This liberalism of the liberals, Lloyd George, for example, and he describes this kind of liberalism as the Edwardian liberal governments contrived a judicious mixture of collectivist or interventionist initiatives with individualism and private enterprise. So they believe that the state should think about welfare programs, but at the same time, they believed in respecting individual freedom and in free trade in economy. Mm-hmm. So the liberals were not becoming socialists. The liberals, for example, did not aspire to acquire the ownership of industry for the state, because this was what Karl Marx stated in the El Capital, Des Capital, that there was going to be a revolution and that all the means of production were going to be, that the system was going to be overthrown. And then in those times, Marx thought about the factories, and that the factories were going to be captured by the workers after the revolution, and that the produce of these factories was going to be distributed fairly among all the workers. But so Marxism or socialism, they think about the ownership of the public ownership of the means of production, que sería el Estado dueño de los medios de producción, de las fábricas, de todo. Well, these liberals were not socialist. They did not think about expropiar las fábricas y ponerlas en control del Estado, ¿no? And even the Labour Party, the party of the worker, was not socialist at the beginning. Was not a socialist. Well, even today, it's not the same socialist or the same kind of socialist parties that the label may suggest. So it was precisely the combination of free trade on the one hand with social and financial reform. This looks like Joe Biden's speeches. So a combination of free trade on the one hand with social and financial reform on the other hand, that enabled the liberals to command support across the boundaries of social class. And they were supported by the workers. And so, as I said before, the working classes voted the liberals and not the Labour Party. So the Labour Party was very weak at the very beginning. And then something that in some way is indicative of a change in the role of the state is that many employers felt the need to improve the health and education of the British labor force. They realized that by having more healthy workers, this was going to increase productivity. This was something new. And they recognized that judicious state intervention, that the state should interfere in some sectors that had been badly served by private investment. This is also another controversy in politics about, for example, if the state should interfere in, for example, transportation. To what extent should the state build new roads, or if new roads should be built by private companies, and users should pay for that. Well, this is also a controversial issue. But something that called my attention is that one of the problems all states have nowadays, the conception of modern states have nowadays, and is the increase in the number of what in Britain called civil service, los empleados públicos. So on page 143, well, you see that the problem we have in Argentina started they were talking about that at the beginning of the 20th century. So more than 100 years about that. What to do with a very huge state with lots of employees, sometimes without any job, without any specific job or function. So in addition, the government was becoming, and this is a quote, was becoming a major employer in its own right. Whereas in 1901, some 960,000 people held jobs in the civil service, en el Estado, in the local governments and the armed forces. By 1911, the total stood at 1,270,000. Well, and so the state started to, in England, more than 100 years ago, to tackle with the specific problems, and in order to deal with specific problems, they created departments, ministries, organizations, which are, of course, which cost, of course, a lot of money. And Lloyd George proposed to tackle this problem by setting aside an annual sum of money from the taxpayers for a development commission. Me hace acordar a los ministerios de desarrollo que tienen un gasto enorme en ministros, asesores, directores, subdirectores para el desarrollo de la agricultura, supongamos, ¿no? But perhaps the most direct challenge to the rights of individuals was the legislation affecting working hours and wages. And for the first time in the 20th century, workers started to demand an 8-hour working day. Okay, so free trade and collectivism. Well, now we go to the Edwardian crisis, that is chapter 18. Well, I've already mentioned that, incidentally, that all these new entitlements on derechos, like pensions for the elderly, free education, school meals, insurance for the unemployed, etc., would necessarily lead to a change in a reform in the system of taxation, because the state needed to collect money. And I also mentioned that this was going to call a crisis, because some vested interests were going to be affected, especially in one of the two houses in Parliament. So the author starts by presenting the Edwardian period, because the title says Edwardian crisis, as a period of chaos, of crisis, because there were strikes for the first time. There was the Irish problem, the suffragettes, the women's movement. The suffragists was a 20th century movement where women were demanding the right to vote, but unlike previous movements, they decided to resort to violent methods. And I recommend a movie called The Suffragettes. I think it is. I think it was released 2 or 3, probably 3 or 4 years ago, and it is very much faithful to history. And so Pew is the author, says, well, although some historians say, well, this was a chaotic period, this is probably an exaggeration. And then he says, well, some historians also say, this is the rhetorical tool used by the author, he presents something and then he starts refuting. So he says many historians think that the Labour Party started to outflank, acerruchar el piso, a quitarle poder a the Liberal Party, because, well, the Liberal Party nowadays doesn't exist. The two main parties in Britain are the Conservatives and the Labour Party. And so they say, well, the Labour Party started in some way replacing or challenging the role of the Liberal Party from the very beginning, because they say, well, in 1906, the Labour Party won 29 seats. That is a success. And then in the election of 1910, the Labour Party obtained 42 seats. And Pew says, well, so this led many researchers to say that the Labour Party was actually, or started actually replacing the Liberal Party before the war. And then Pew says, however. So be careful when you study. This warning has been mentioned before. So don't read the first paragraph of the first line, because later on, or don't read only this first part, because sometimes the first paragraph is just a thesis statement, like in language, and then the rest of the chapter is used to destroy this idea. So even when many people think that the liberals were being replaced by the Labour Party was growing, he says, in recent years, research has undermined this interpretation in several ways. It has shown how far the liberals adapted their programs. So the Labour Party was not as strong as it may happen just by looking at the number of MPs. And why? Well, because the first Labour leaders, they realized that they had much more in common in their political agendas with the Liberal Party than with the Conservative Party. And consequently, they came to an agreement by means of which they did not compete among themselves. So in some constituencies where they perceived that there was where the Labour leader was probably or had more chances of winning, the Liberal candidate withdrew. So all the votes went to. So they were trying to avoid the split of the anti-conservative vote. Okay. Split es la división del voto no conservador. Entonces no competían. Dijeron, a ver, tenemos 450 constituencies Entonces, a ustedes que son chiquititos, los liberales decían, bueno, en 50 nosotros no nos vamos a meter ahí, le dejamos a ustedes para que ganen. Y como no competían los liberales, era un acuerdo que tenían, entonces los labors ganaban porque no se dividía el voto anticonservador, ¿no? So this is known as the Lib-Lab, Liberal Labor Electoral Pact, un acuerdo electoral. And this explains how or why the Labours obtained 42 seats. So the Labour Party was not as strong as the numbers or the number of MPs who got elected may suggest. Okay. Well, another aspect that in some way manages to explain this electoral pact between the two parties, between the Liberal and the Labour Party, is that the leading Labour politicians, the leaders of the Labour Party, who are going to appear in future chapters, in future sets in the syllabus. There's one that is very famous, MacDonald. You will remember MacDonald. Hardy and Henderson. They were essentially working class liberals because they believed in free trade, but they also believed in the rights of the workers. So they were not socialist. So on page 147, you have a summary of what these first leaders of the Labour Party believed in. And as soon as you read this, you will realize that they were not socialist. So they advocated free trade, Irish home rule, parliamentary reform. So these were all liberal issues. And they included social welfare, los programas de bienestar social, graduated taxation of wealth, especially land. And so in some way they were like one of the wings of the Liberal Party, the radical wing of the Liberal Party. Okay? And later on, so the Labour Party was relatively weak, but later on there were, in 1913, trade unions, as trade unions were growing in number, trade unions were allowed to collect a regular political levy, like a kind of money workers were asked to pay for the party. And this is very important because all these trade unions or working class movements or even the Labour Party, they were not anti-system, so they were not trying to overthrow the parliamentary system. On the other hand, they were working to be elected to that system and to change the injustices or to remedy the injustices, but by taking part in the system. So this is very different from Marxism. Marxism wants to overthrow the system, to change the system. So the Labour Party or even the trade unions and all the strikes that we are going to see later on prove that they were actually organizing strikes, huelgas, to ask for specific issues like an increase in salaries or improvement in the working conditions, but they were not thinking about overthrowing the system, changing the system, even when the system was not fair. This is the following topic that is known as industrial militancy. So there were many strikes, of course, and there you have that. For example, between 1902 and 1906, there were between 300 and 400 strikes. But then between 1906 and 1914, there were 800 and between 800 and 900 strikes, huelgas. And what was even more dangerous for the government is that for the first time unions, like for example the railway union or the transport union, etc., they started to use a concept that sometimes is used in Argentina and that I bitterly criticized, that is known as the concept of sympathetic strikes. It's like kind of solidarity. Okay, so if there is a, I don't know, a problem with the strike in the workers of one particular either private company or state company, then other workers go on a strike to show solidarity with those other workers. And this was known as a threat. The most alarming example was known as the triple alliancing, comprising the miners, mineros, the railway men, and transport workers. So the government was allied when they realized that these very powerful unions started to act as only one group. Well, and then something that I've just said, while the involvement in strikes helped to promote working class consciousness, this is a concept of the left, of socialism, working class consciousness, conciencia conciencia sobre la clase trabajadora, o no sé cómo dicen en español, pero es working class consciousness. Even when all these strikes promoted this does not prove that militancy, all these strikes, that there were lots of strikes at that time, heralded or aimed at destroying the system. A general rejection of parliamentary government. There is little evidence that the strikes were political. In Argentina, there are many strikes that are political. So in this particular case, there were many strikes, but the strikes were held in order to ask for something specific and to any government. And then we go to the constitutional conflict. So the author says, even when there was chaos, even when there were lots of strikes, even when at times it seems that all the unions were going to unite into only one big union, and the most terrifying scenario was a general strike. Then we are going to see in 1924, there was a general strike, un paro general, so it paralyzed the whole country. But this did not happen. This only took place after the war. And then the last topic is the constitutional, no, it's not the last one, but the following topic is constitutional conflict. And here I want to explain, I've already explained that, but in this particular case, we're going to see how the system got changed. In the parliamentary system in Britain, there are two houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And up until 1911, well, we know that of these two houses, only one house, the House of Commons, is an elected house. It's a democratic house. The House of Lords, in those times, nowadays it's different, but in those times was formed by members of the nobility, or many of them belong to the Conservative Party, as it's only natural. And so from time to time, there were situations, not very frequent, when the House of Lords used the power of veto. The power of veto is the power to reject the legislation passed in the House of Commons. In our system, in Argentina, there are two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And for any bill to become an act, para que cualquier proyecto de ley se transforme en una ley, it needs the approval of both houses. So it may be passed in the House of Representatives, and if the bill goes to the to the Senate, Senado, and is rejected in the Senate, well, the bill has to go back to the House of Representatives, and if it is rejected completely, it cannot be treated during the whole year. This is what happened with la ley de aborto, por ejemplo, interrupción del embarazo. Well, so up until 1911 in Britain, because nowadays it is different, the House of Lords had the power of veto, like the Senate here. And so when George Lloyd introduced the People's Budget implied introducing new taxes on land. And so many of the members of the House of Lords, if not all of them, were landowners. And so they were going to pay more taxes. And so they decided to veto the People's Budget. And well, this was like the last straw for the Liberal government. And so they organized a new election asking people for the popular mandate to tax the landowners who were represented in the House of Lords. And well, there you will read the most well-known speeches pronounced by Lord George, who made 10,000 men the owners of the soil, and the rest of us trespassers in the land of our birth. This is a very inflammatory speech, and it seems to be pronounced by a socialist, not by a liberal. But this was a way in which Lloyd George was trying to get the popular support to pass the budget. And of course, he won the election, and the Lords were in some way forced to not only to pass the People's Budget, which they didn't want to, but they were also forced to vote for a reform in the House of Lords. So this is a very important reform, the parliamentary reform of 1911, because from 1911 onwards, the Lords were deprived of the power of veto. So from 1911 onwards, a bill is introduced in the House of Commons. If it is approved in the House of Commons, it goes to the House of Lords. If the Lords veto it, it goes back to the House of Commons, and if it is passed 3 consecutive times in the House of Commons, it becomes an act, regardless the veto of the Lords. So the Lords was deprived of most of its power in that year. Then we're going to see another reform in 1949 that deprived the Lords of almost all the power. So nowadays the House of Lords doesn't have it's just like a consultative body of experts. They are not members of the nobility anymore, but they have no power at all. The power is in the House of Commons. So it's very important because it was a constitutional crisis. The government wanted to pass a bill. The bill passed the House of Commons, but went to the House of Lords. And the bill was what people had demanded, because people had voted the members of the House of Commons, and the members of the House of Lords are not elected by the people. So that's why it's called the constitutional crisis, because for the first time, even when Britain doesn't have a constitution, for the first time they started to think that the system had to be changed. That the House of Lords, as the House of Lords was not democratic, so the House of Lords could not have the same power as the House of Commons, and it happened in this constitutional crisis. Then we go to the Irish Home Rule crisis. Well, we read in previous chapters that Gladstone had attempted many times to pass a home rule. We also said that this home rule is not the same, that home rule is not the same as independence, that it merely wanted to re-establish a parliament in Dublin, and this parliament was going to be to have only powers to deal with internal issues of Ireland, because all the external issues were retained by the British government. But this situation, of course, was not accepted by the Unionists. When we speak about the two groups about the Irish conflict, there are two groups: the Irish and the English Irish. So why are they called English Irish? Because they were born in Ireland, and there are several generations of these English Irish who have been born in Ireland, and so they are as Irish as the other Irish. But as they are descendants from the English, they want Ireland to continue being part of Britain, and that's why they are called Unionist. And on the other hand, we've got the original Irish with a different religion. The original Irish are Catholics, are Catholic, and they want separation. And well, when the bill was passed and was about to become an act of parliament, this situation was not accepted by the Unionists, the other group of the English Irish, and the two groups started to gather guns, weapons, and so Ireland was on the verge of a civil war. And then was the outbreak of the First World War, or World War One, in some way postponed the conflict in Ireland. And then we're going to see what the British government decided to do after the war. That in fact was to partition Ireland between two parts, one for the English Irish and the other part for the rest of the Irish. And the last topic I'm going to deal with briefly, because I've already recommended the film, is the suffragettes. In the movements, the demands on the part of women, not only women but also men, like John Stuart Mill, for example, was a very famous liberal who advocated for women's right to vote in the 1860s and 70s. So in the 20th century, some women started to realize, or they came to the conclusion that after many decades of fighting or demanding the right to vote, they had obtained nothing. And so there were two leaders, Mrs. Emily Pankhurst and her daughter, Christabel, who decided that the method of protest should be changed. And they abandoned these peaceful methods and they resorted to more violent methods, like, for example, breaking windows or setting fire to post offices, chaining themselves to the House of Parliament. Well, lots of, when they got arrested, they started hunger strikes, que son las huelgas de hambre, perdón, and in an attempt or trying to, so that they were set free, they were released from the police stations or the prisons. But later on, and this is also shown in the film that I am recommending, the government forced them to eat by introducing like a tube. It's actually called tube feeding, through their mouth and so to their stomachs. So you can imagine how painful it was, so that they could not die, because some of them simply went into these hunger strikes and refused to eat. And so it was terribly violent. And the film also shows the that in those times women actually, this was about more than a century ago, women had no right at all. The film actually shows that. It's a married woman, and she has no rights at all. Not right on the children, not any right to disagree with their husbands. They could not vote. They were paid less than men, and that's why they were determined to change that. Okay. Well, and then many of these conflicts, and that's why this is called the crisis, the Edwardian crisis, were not solved, but they were postponed by the outbreak of World War I, the First World War. There are two wars, and then the war is going to be very important for the women's movement, because as men were went to the war, women had to replace men in factories and everywhere, and it wasn't, and so consequently, this was the most influential element that in some way convinced the establishment, the government, that women had the same capacity to do anything as men. And that's why after the war, women were given the right to vote first at a later stage at 30, because they were considered immature, and later on they were given the right to vote in the same conditions as men. All right. Well, let's see the chat if there's any question, and then we'll. I think there's a question. What does the sentence "the working class"? What does the sentence "the working class began to be drawn closely into the system" mean? Yes, exactly. They realized that in order to improve their working conditions, the best way to do it was through politics, because well, this is just a personal commentary. Sometimes you talk to people, and some of my friends keep telling me, why do you get involved into politics? Why don't you just relax and live your life happily? Or people who say, I don't like politics, or I'm not interested in politics. Well, there's no such thing that is going to affect your lives in every single respect than politics. Politics is going to change everything: your rights, your money, your property, justice, education. Everything has to do with politics. So they realized, the working class began to be drawn closely into the system, because the socialism, for example, advocated as I said before, Marxism advocated a revolution, so of the workers. So the author is saying, well, instead of going to Marxism and organizing, or started to organize a revolution to change the system, the workers in Britain, they said, okay, the best way to change the system is to create a political party and be elected. And to change the system, that's why it says, more involved in the political system, in the parties, in campaigning with the liberals, in getting elected, in having more MPs in parliament. Industrial militancy. Okay. Have I answered the question, Karin, or the title of the film is the same title of the topic, the suffragettes. Creo que en español es las sufragistas. Las sufragistas. El mismo título del capítulo. Is set in England, of course. In Las sufragistas. La pueden ver y les va a ayudar muchísimo, porque, bueno, Siempre uno aprende mejor cuando a través de imágenes y de la historia, ¿no? The plot of the film. The suffragettes. If I'm not mistaken, yes, I think it's las sufragistas. Googleenla como las sufragistas. It must be 3 years old, I think. It's not that old. It's not that old. Las sufragistas, and it is British. Okay, any other question? So remember, Sebastian is going to organize the oral reports into pairs from now on. Okay. Josuha, the movie. Okay, thank you. Well, you already have the link to watch it. Watch it. It will help you a lot, at least in that topic. Or if you're interested in this kind of feminism known as equality feminism, el feminismo de la igualdad. This is one of the waves of feminism, de las olas de feminismo. This is known as the first wave. The first wave, la primera ola de feminismo, is the suffragettes. Then we're going to see the second wave of feminism, and then the third, the present day feminism is the third wave of feminism. Okay, questions? Okay, the time is up. Just any question before we finish for today? No questions? Okay. Well, that's all for today. Thank you very much. These 2 chapters are very judicious, so I recommend reading them, bearing in mind what I've analyzed here, because it marked a very deep change in the conceptions about the role of the state. Okay, that's all for today, and see you next Monday. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bye-bye.